Helen Keller, Chapter 4. It's called The Worst Fight of All. Helen didn't know that Annie had come to help her. All she knew was that a stranger was trying to make her do things she didn't understand, things she didn't want to do. So 6-year-old Helen did what she'd been doing for years. She fought back. She ran, she hid, she fought with sly tricks. One day Helen locked Annie in her room and hid the key. Helen's mother tried to get Helen to show her where she had hidden the key. Helen just turned away and smiled. Finally, her father had to put a ladder up to the window and carry Annie down like a sack of potatoes. But most of the time Helen fought with her fists. Day by day those fights grew worse. Helen was stronger, but the stranger was stronger. Helen could fight for hours, but this stranger never seemed to tire. "It's that little bit of strength that's going to save us," Annie Sullivan wrote a friend one day, "and if she doesn't kill us both first." Annie tried to keep cheerful. It was not always easy. One day Helen's hand brushed against Annie's face and came away wet. Helen didn't know what tears meant, so she just turned away. Then came the worst fight of all. Helen had the table manners of a pig. She knew how to use her knife and fork and spoon, but she liked to use her hands instead. She began each meal in her own chair, but she never stayed there for long. Most of the time she wandered from place to place, grabbing what she wanted from other people's plates. Annie watched with horror as Helen stuffed other people's food in her mouth, but Annie didn't say anything, so long as Helen stayed away from her. Then one morning, Helen stopped behind Annie's chair. Her nose wriggled to sort out the smells. What was that on the stranger's plate? She sniffed again. Then she knew. It was sausage, and Helen loved sausage. But did she dare? Helen stood there for a moment. Then she touched her way around the table again. At every chair she stopped and sniffed. Everyone else's sausage was gone. Now here she was, back at the stranger's plate. Once more the delicious smell of sausage came drifting up to her. It was just too much. Out flashed Helen's hand. Down came the stranger's on top of it. Helen tried to jerk free. The stranger held on tight. And one by one she peeled Helen's fingers away from the sausage. Here's the picture. "Oh, let her have it just this once," Mr. Keller said. "She doesn't know any better." Annie shook her head. "She must learn that other people have rights too," she answered. So the fight began. Helen kicked and screamed. She pounded her fists on the floor. Helen's mother and father hated to see her this upset. They got up and left the room quickly. Annie locked the door behind them. Then she went back to her chair. For a while Annie sat. Helen rolled and raged on the floor. But Helen was growing hungrier every minute. What was the stranger doing? Was there any sausage left on her plate? Finally Helen got up to find out. She sniffed, and yes, there was some sausage left. Helen's hand crept forward. Annie pushed it back. Helen's hand crept forward again. Annie pushed it away again. Helen lost her temper, but this time she didn't yell and scream. She just pinched the stranger's arm as hard as she could. Annie slapped back hard. Helen shook herself. That hurt, but it didn't stop her. Helen pinched the stranger again, and once more Annie slapped Helen. Pinch, slap, pinch, slap. "I can keep this up as long as you can," Annie Sullivan said. Suddenly Helen wheeled away. She touched her way around the table again, but all the chairs were empty. Everyone else was gone. Helen raced for the door. She tugged on it as hard as she could. It wouldn't open. Then Helen knew. She was locked in with the stranger, and all the understanding arms were gone. Helen backed against the wall. She wanted to stay as far away from Annie as she could, but she was growing more and more hungry. Finally Helen edged her way back to the table again and began to eat with her fingers. Annie sighed and put a spoon in Helen's hand. Helen held it for a moment, then she threw it as hard as she could across the room. Annie pulled Helen out of her chair and dragged her across the room to pick up the spoon. Then she plunked her back in her seat again. "Now you're going to eat that oatmeal," Annie said, "and with that spoon." Helen kicked, she screamed, she wriggled like an eel, but inch by inch, Annie Sullivan forced the spoon up to Helen's mouth. She forced Helen to swallow one spoonful, then another. Then Annie began to relax. Too soon. Helen jerked free. She threw the spoon at Annie. Annie ducked, and everything started all over again. But this time Helen didn't fight so hard. She was so hungry and so tired. This time when Annie let go, Helen kept right on eating until finally her bowl was empty, her breakfast all gone. But so was the morning. Here's the picture. The sun was high overhead when Annie finally unlocked the door. Smells of lunch filled the house. Annie led Helen outside to wander in the garden. She went to her room to think. Things could not go on this way much longer. Something would have to be done, and fast. But what? Annie paced back and forth across the room. Slowly a plan began to form in her mind. But first she would have to talk to Helen's mother. It was not going to be easy to find the right words. The end of that chapter.